down the 8 most common reasons most players die way too much. Thanks to EA for sponsoring this video. Number 1, you're fighting for far too long. This is something that everyone has experienced, and more than just once, I'm sure. And I'll be honest, certain situations can be extremely tough to just speed up. But when you're fighting, you're naturally drawing attention. Bullets, explosions, abilities, all will be ringing out, and sometimes from several hundred meters away. Now, during all of this time, it's fair to assume another team is hearing this interaction and is on their way to try to get involved. If you can at least prep with this thought in mind when a fight is becoming prolonged, then you're already going to be ahead of a lot of the player base. You don't want to just be shooting because you can. You want to be shooting with intention, whether that's to level up your Evo armor while you hold a solid position, or if it's to just get some initial damage so you're able to close the gap to your enemies and fight them up close. Now, everything should be a part of your greater plan. And I do believe fights to go on too long because of another reason, but I'll get into that in a moment. A good rule of thumb you want to live by is this 20-second rule. If your fight is going on beyond 20 seconds, it's time to either go into 4th gear and try to wrap the fight up while being mindful of any incoming third parties, or you can start to back up and try to find better positioning so that you can pause this fight, but from a safe spot, and be mindful of a third party coming in. This way, you can take a lot of the attention that was on you and shift it onto a new team that may be approaching. Now, this will be especially helpful in the ranked mode, where more teams are just generally alive for longer periods of time, and a lot more players are hyper aware of a third party opportunity. Number 2, poor positioning. Now, this one will put you in a disadvantaged spot even when you don't mean to. At times, while we're traversing the map, we can all suffer from bad positioning. It's not always going to be your fault, but what you want to try to learn from that is that when you're in an area that you're familiar with and you know is not favorable to you or even your teammates, especially if your enemy was to attack you, then you want to be able to find the quickest spot to reposition yourself so that you're not so vulnerable. Now, common features like high ground, large amount of cover, a building with minimal entry and exit points are all generally great areas for good positioning. But the best tip I can give you is always try to move in between different pieces of cover, even if you aren't actively engaging with an enemy. We know this is a game of seconds, so in the event you do get ambushed, or in the event you're pushing a known enemy but they don't necessarily know where you are pushing from or your whole team is pushing from, you always want to be near some form of cover because it's definitely going to help you out. In theory, you'll be taking less damage and you'll have better positioning over your opponent. Now, cover isn't a novel idea in any FPS shooter, but players don't always tend to gravitate towards it unless they're really experienced in looking for it. So although this may seem fairly basic, you'd be surprised how many times our minds will just have us drift off because maybe we're not being mindful about our surroundings and we find ourselves in a worse spot and our opponents in a better spot. And this makes us much more susceptible to dying to them. Number 3, you're not shield swapping, or certainly not enough. This is one of the fundamental skills in Apex, and as you continue to progress through the game, it becomes more vital to do, but it's also a true skill gap. I'm sure most of you know about this mechanic by now, but you're just underutilizing it when it comes down to it in game. Whether it's that white armor on the ground that you can quickly swap to in the heat of a fight, or it's remembering that you wiped a squad 10 meters from you and there's still a blue armor swap in one of the boxes that you can get to quickly. It's all important to remember and execute. Armor swapping can be practiced in the firing range now, whereas before we just had to get better at it in game, which is where I recommend you to practice it the most. And if you're on mouse and keyboard, make sure you're utilizing moving around, jumping, and or crouching while you're in the death box grabbing that swap. For all my controller players, I recommend getting used to grabbing armor swaps quickly first and then incorporating a jump while you're going into the box so that you're not just a sitting duck in the box when you're going for that swap. Controller players can't really move around in a death box, certainly not like mouse and keyboard players can. And yes, I do know about a couple little tactics that allow for some slight movement, but I've found the jump, interact into the box is the most consistent way to get the swap and utilize some form of movement. Now, lastly, you must begin to be aware of what boxes your teammates have already swapped as well. Countless times I'll see players neglect to pay attention to what box their teammate just swapped as they're running to that box while cracked, only to be shocked that that armor swap is gone. That usually results in them dying as well. In most cases, you'll be able to tell which boxes your teammates already swapped if you just pay attention to their armor levels and what death boxes are where. Number 4, healing. Now, healing is the cornerstone of thriving in this game. If you overheal in certain moments where just team firing that enemy would result in them dying sooner and your teammates staying alive, then you could be making a grave mistake. On the contrary, and what is far more common for players is not healing soon enough and in safe spots. shields. Now, I don't care how basic this sounds. It's something that I see at all levels in coaching Apex. And for you more experienced players, I guarantee you it's probably about balancing when to heal when you're in a clutch up moment, like trying to complete a 1v3 or a 1v2. I see good players in these scenarios miscalculate constantly when they should heal or not healing at all. But first off, you gotta make sure you have enough shields and health whenever possible. Ideal amounts are 2 to 4 shield batteries, more is always better, 8 to 12 shield cells, 4 syringes, and 2 med kits. Now these are just ideals, it's not set in stone, but if you can shoot for that, you should be chilling. Remember, your backpack size, what you can find, if you'll be taking more zone damage, are all important variables when calculating what the amount of shield and health you need to carry is. But let's talk in some simple terms. If you take more damage than you deal and you have the time and space to heal, use it. If you downed one player and took 100 damage and your armor is now cracked, but you know you're going to have to fight one more player who is presumed to be full health and shields, you're going to have little chance in winning that if you aren't able to heal or reset with an armor swap. This is as simple as I can make it, guys. Health and shields is all just a numbers game, but it's crucial you pay attention to this at every single moment during the game, because trust me, every good player you watch does this and does it well. Number 5, incorrect ability usage, or just flat out using the wrong legend for your playstyle. Using abilities incorrectly, whether that's at the wrong time, wrong place, or forgetting to use them altogether because you've been maining a different legend and forgot what your current legend does. I mean, all of these things can and will affect how your fights play out. The longer that Apex has been around, the more abilities have continued to play a significant role in fights. Now, once you understand the concepts of what your legend can do, it's going to be time to take in where and how they really thrive. At the end of the day, this is probably what draws so many people to keep coming over to Apex and getting into the game. Another angle to look at this from, though, that is super important is understanding what your enemy is capable of with their legend's abilities. This helps you make split-second predictions or reads on what you believe their next move will be. If you're forgetting to use your abilities, it may be time to hone in on 1 or 2 legends to focus on. I know a lot of you probably have a main legend, but if you're one of the players who doesn't, or you feel like your main just isn't cutting it, it's best you get to mastering just 1 or 2 of the legends. This way you can learn the different ways to outplay and outmaneuver your opponents. And constantly switching your legend could be screwing up your ability to have a deep understanding of what's at play in this game. Number 6, and this one is super important, overextending and getting focus fired. You guys love to talk about this one all the time in my comments section, and it's the main thing you're going to want to watch out for if you're going to take anything away from this video. Simply put, more gunfire on you speeds up how quickly you'll die in this game. If you're not mindful of overextending, you will be getting clipped up fast. I'm sure you've had a lot of sweaty matches this season and died to a very coordinated team. This will feel very frustrating because it's going to feel like you didn't even have a chance, or at least a fair one at that. But listen, the same thing is true on the flip side. Team firing with your squad mates is going to make your life easier and help you get more kills. But back to overextending. One thing that helped me correct this bad habit was being extremely mindful of where my teammates were at all times, especially in accordance to where I believe or know my enemies to be. This way I can rarely overextend and be surprised by it. Now I'll admit, if you're solo queuing, this isn't always going to be easy. Predicting what your random may or may not do is a tricky thing to manage. However, if you're able to apply all of these things that I've gone over into your gameplay and you're being mindful about your positioning, well, I guarantee you'll find yourself overextending less and less. No one really tries to overextend for a kill unless they're being extremely greedy and like ego challenging a fight. This really starts from just not paying attention a ton or not making the right read on the situation. But if you truly practice being mindful of all of these things, well, the game will be yours for the taking. Trust me. Number 7 is players giving up. A lot of players tend to give up when their teammates go down. It's like they almost know their fate is determined already or something. And that could look like just running in blindly into a building where you don't really know what's going on and you're trying to be helpful, or it could just mean forgetting all of the principles in the game that you work hard on, like position, timing of your abilities, inventory management, and much more. Personally, for me, I think the best feeling in this game is clutching up a fight, especially when you have to like 1v3 or something like that. And you're not going to experience that, or at least often, if you tend to give up. Now, I know some situations the fight will just be flat out unwinnable, and I get that, but that's certainly not going to be every time. And remember, you're playing against other people who want similar things as you do, so you can't just rest on your laurels. You got to try to take it from them. And number 8 is very similar to number 7, but it differs just slightly, and I'm calling it hero ball. What is this? Well, it's when you're trying to be too good of a teammate, but at the expense of truly taking care of the moment. As a result, you're going to throw your game. While this is similar to number 7, I swear people always gravitate to this at one time or another, at least until they truly learn how to process the different steps in Apex. You have to be disciplined and mentally acute when it comes to clutching fights. I mean, you don't even need the best gun skill or movement. You need to outwit your enemy. There's several different examples I could list, but just imagine both your teammates go down and they're inside a building or something where you can't see all of the enemies. You are blindly running in there because you want to be next to your teammates because you feel like you kind of missed out on some action, and you get clipped by all 3 players team firing you. This is the epitome of playing hero ball. You want to be helpful. It's not like you're actually giving up. It's that you're not actually thinking about the situation at play. Another example is you could be in the process of trying to clutch a fight, and let's say it's down to the last guy. And instead of just abusing the high ground that you have over them, you rush off of high ground and you try to speed up the fight. And in doing so, you kind of give away your leverage in that fight. This is another example of playing hero ball. What it boils down to is just not thinking enough about the situation. You're rushing it because you want the outcome and you want to try to be that good teammate. For newer players, this could look like going to revive your down teammate even when you know it's a bad time to do so. Like, newer players love to go for a revive when they know they're just like, I wasn't at the fight, I've got to try to be helpful here, and while I'm reviving, I'm getting shot in the back. There's so many different examples that could fall under this category, but what it all boils down to is just trying to take in the information, build up your skills, and not throw them all away in the heat of the moment, because in the heat of the moment is where you're going to need to apply all of these skills. Otherwise, the player on the other end of the fight is going to use that against you and take you out. In this video, I'm going to be talking about landing, looting, and inventory management. Now, there are a lot of new players in Apex right now, and there are a ton that are also returning, and there are just players who've been playing for some time and still don't really understand how this stuff works. So let's get right into it. Now, let's start off with how to land properly. Now, there are really 2 different examples here that I'm going to cover: when you're contested and when you're uncontested. But there are going to be some nuances with each one. So let's start off with being uncontested. Let's say you and your squad, whether you're playing with friends or you're playing with randoms, are being uncontested and you're landing in a POI. The goal here should be so that you guys all split up among your each respective area within the POI. Now, if it's a really large POI like Skyhook or something, then you definitely want to use your discretion here to look around to see if a team went countdown or potentially survey camp or any of the nearby POIs that might venture into Skyhook, especially if the zone ends up pulling to that area. You don't want to be landing too far away from one another, but you want to give yourself enough area so that you're not looting on top of one another. Far too often, players will just land in the same exact area, and that screws one another up. Most of you know this because there's only so many loot paths, right? And if 2 of you are looting the same path, that just means there's less to go around. It's a really simple concept. However, one of the worst parts about Apex is that people who are the jump master can't force the players to break off from them. It works the other way around. So if you aren't the jump master, you're able to break off as soon as you want and land in the area that you want to go into. What usually screws up players, particularly while solo queuing, is they'll be the jump master, they'll ping a spot that they want to land to, they are uncontested, and then 1 or 2 of their randoms land right on top of them, and it just screws them over. And in these situations, look, there's really nothing you can do except start to run in a different direction and hopefully lose your own respective area. If players are paying attention though, splitting up helps you because the sooner you guys all get looted up, the sooner you can either move on to rotate if you need to, or look for a fight if that's what you want to do. The point here is that you want to make this as efficient as possible, and that starts with looting your respective areas and then meeting up after 60 to 90 seconds or so, depending on when you need to leave and what you're planning to do next. If it's a smaller POI, then this may be a little bit more difficult. Say it's a POI like Geyser. Well, someone should land in the back, and then the other 2 should split the U-shaped buildings. Now, when it comes to being contested, I want to preface with, well, it really depends on where the enemy team is landing, and let's just assume for simplicity's sake, it's a 50-50. You know, your team and the enemy team. Now, with each POI, there will be differences here that you want to evaluate, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach because the enemy team could land in one spot in one match, and you could have a good counter to that, but then in the next match, they land in a totally different way, and that screws up how you wanted to land or that you were used to landing. Oh, and one really important factor that every player on the team must learn to do is free look around while they drop. Now, I've been preaching this for years now, but it's something that will give you the information about where you should land and where your enemies are landing as well. If you're not free looking, you're really just putting blinders on, and it's just going to negatively affect your gameplay because it's going to affect the lack of information you have about your surroundings. You need to learn to free look while still dropping. Too many players give me the excuse of like, well, I'm jump master, so I can't look around. Wrong. You need to build this skill up. You can focus on your drop and focus on free looking at the same time. You're going to have to balance learns it more so than the person who may not be jump master, but it's still a skill you want to develop and enhance, especially if you solo queue, because you can't just count on your enemies to free look and communicate what they're seeing and whatnot. So free looking is of the utmost importance. Now back to the contest. Now speaking broadly here, there are 3 things that I always look out for when it comes to a contest. Now first is I always want to see if I can land in some sort of high ground. Obviously high ground will give you a positional advantage in a fight, but it also lets you see a lot more regarding your surroundings. For example, atop of a building will give you a better vantage point to see out regarding your next move. Second is if I'm landing in an area where I could get pinched, could be trapped, and when I say trapped, I imagine either getting surrounded by multiple enemies or multiple teams, or even just trapped on the map. Now this would be mostly applicable in an edge POI like Climatizer, so anything where the map is just going to run out of space. If things go bad and you don't have a good area to fall back to, that could wind up harming you. And third is I always want to land right on something that I can quickly access a chance at a weapon or two. I don't want to land then have to run 30 feet to the nearest loot spawn and have my enemy already get shots at me before I even got to a place where a weapon can spawn. Now you obviously can't control weapon spawns, but you can go to the places where loot does spawn, and that will give you the highest chance of success. Of course, we've all landed on a bin and got 2 sniper stocks and a frag grenade, while our enemy opened another bin and got a Mastiff and an R301. But what I'm really talking about is you don't want to land in a spot, waste time running to the nearest loot spawn because either you weren't paying attention or, yeah, it really will just come down to paying attention. Because some players who are new aren't going to necessarily know where all the loot spawns are, and that will just take time to build up. But through experience, you will gather that and you will know, okay, there are pills here, okay, loot spawns here on the ground, things of that nature. But assuming you already have that awareness, really try to think about these 3 things. Now, in most situations where you get contested in a certain POI, you want to think about what area can you and your teammates occupy, and basically, you kind of want to be a little greedy here. If you got to split this one POI among 6 players, your team versus their team, and you don't want to give them more space than your team occupies. This isn't always something you can control, but it's something you want to look out for. If you see a team that is sticking together right up until the landing, then that jump master is going to land those other 3 players wherever they go. And that could be super beneficial to you and your squad if you pick up on it and if you choose to land in your own desired location, which is what I'm recommending to do. You'll see in this clip here where we land at the wall POI on Storm Point, I told my teammates, watch where they go and try to take as much space as you can. So basically we got one side of the wall, which is 2 buildings and 2 different sections of pills, and they got the same thing, relatively speaking, but they all landed on one building with the pills outside of it. So that helped us because they didn't really split up their landing at all, and so we knew to move on them rather quickly and roll the dice, assuming that not only did we have better loot, but we had more space and we had a great idea of where they all were at and where they'd be heading to next, because I would assume 1 or 2 players wouldn't find enough loot, which would mean they would try to run to that back right building, and that got them split up. This made it really simple for us to attack them and gave us some extra confidence, and this is something that the best players use against their opponents, so I'm telling you to use it against yours. Now, when it comes to landing with more than one other team, this could be considered a hot drop where you land with 3 or more teams in one POI. And there's a couple different ways to play this. Of course, if it's in ranked, I'll just straight up say this is rarely a good idea to do, as each team is generally going to be thinking, yeah, let's let the other 2 teams fight first and then we'll third party. This can create a stalemate among all of the teams, and where no one ends up really fighting and then no one has a lot of loot, or maybe your team just doesn't have a lot of loot, and this will screw you up the rest of your game because you may not find a lot of other opportunities to gather loot except from just fighting. Now, if it's a pub and you just want to get into some action and get your hands dirty, well, really think about 2 things. Can you land on the edge of the POI and work your way in so that you're not forced to fight if you don't find good loot? This is the more passive approach, but it's also more strategic. But there is also the approach of just landing in the middle of that thing and getting right into it and seeing if you can fight your way out. This can be fun to pull off with friends, but most of the time with randoms, it will go poorly, at least in my experience. Sure, maybe 1 out of 10 games you'll frag out and you'll make it out of that POI and you'll carry your randoms through that hot drop. But for the most part, you'll be stuck having to try to 1v9 with just like 1 weapon and 2 shield cells. So it can get pretty rough. But if you're gonna hot drop, really think about where everybody's going and think about how big the POI is in the event that you can't get your weapon, where you're landing, where will you move to next, so on and so forth. Okay, now let's get into inventory management. Now, inventory management will scale up as you progress throughout the match, because ultimately The longer you stay alive, theoretically, the more loot you'll find and the more your loot will upgrade. Now let's say we're starting into a match. 2 cells, 2 syringes, no weapon, no backpack, white armor, white helmet. Okay, I'm gonna start off, I find a triple take, and then I find an R99. So with the R99, I'll probably find 40 ammo, and with the triple take, I'll probably find 20. So you can see here, I've got 10 slots, and basically what I want to think about is what's my primary and what's my secondary. So in most examples, the triple take will probably be the primary, unless a lot of the fights I wind up in are close range. But I don't necessarily always get to control that, so that's why I'm starting triple take in weapon 1. Now it doesn't really matter where the weapon is, whether it's 1 or 2. I mean, it kind of does, but you can always swap it if you want. So for a weapon like the triple take, an ideal amount, because it's a single fire gun, I probably want